Welcome back to World Studies. This is your last video of week 5. I know it's already the end of the week. Hopefully by this point you've done the one assignment for chapter 18. You took the chapter 18 test, and you've done the one assignment for chapter 19. Please remember that when you turn in your packets today that you separate your notes from everything else that you are turning in. Please keep your notes. Do not turn them in. You need these notes because we will be still in this chapter next week. All right, let's get back into it. We've been talking about the Cold War. Remember, a Cold War is a war in which there isn't any actual fighting taking place between the two major sides, but rather it's more of a competition. And the question might be asked, well, why in the world is the Cold War happening? I thought the US and the USSR were allies during World War II. The answer is yes, they were, mostly because of an even greater enemy, Hitler. Well, now that World War II is over, things have begun to settle down. The true colors of both countries are revealing themselves. The U.S. is trying to promote freedom and democracy and peace around the world, while the Soviet Union is seeking to gain control, gain power, gain influence around the world. And these two opposing views are going to shape the Cold War. For the next 40 years, they will be fighting this Cold War. Rarely will it result in fighting, but rather a contest between the two to control the future of the world. So, letter A, differences between democracy and communism. I remember when I was a kid, young kid, I know back in the dark ages, it was called the 1990s. I think naturally I understood the difference between democracy and communism. Democracy was the good guys, communism was the bad guys. And that's what I've been raised to learn because the people who taught me grew up in the Cold War era and it was just coming off of the Cold War. And so the idea of democracy versus communism was still fresh on many people's minds. But today I've noticed in many classrooms, if I were to ask students to identify the differences between democracy and communism, one, they couldn't, and two, they wouldn't know which one the U.S. is, for example. Well, we need to know the differences between democracy and communism, not just because it's going to be on a test, not because, by the way, students, this is the topic of the essay that you need to do. If you want more information, it's found on page 351, but also just simple common sense knowledge as we get involved in the bigger world. We need to know simple things like the difference between a democracy and communism, and to know which one is better, which one is worse. Now, we're not going to go into great detail. This is, after all, 7th grade history. Save it for a college course or even a high school course. But we are going to go into a little bit about the differences between the two. In your notes, it has it divided. US, USSR, the political cartoon shown in the middle shows, of course, the US, USSR arm wrestling for control of the world. Then the flags of the US and the Soviet Union. First of all, the US favored capitalism. The USSR favored socialism. As discussed in previous chapters, capitalism is the economic system where businesses are privately owned and allowed to compete. Socialism is where the government controls businesses and determines what ought to be produced. For the Soviets, that mostly meant military equipment. Another difference was that the U.S. practiced democracy. That's the idea where the people rule. USSR practiced communism, where the people have no say. In a democracy, the people are able to influence and affect government operations. In communism, the party controlled the government and the people had no say in government operations. A third and final difference between the US and USSR is that, at least nominally, the US was a Christian nation, while the USSR was an atheistic nation. I like this comment on atheism, this humorous definition. The belief that there was nothing and nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything, and then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits, which then turned into dinosaurs. Makes perfect sense. When read that way, makes people wonder, how can I believe in atheism? Well, the USSR saw religion as a drug that pacifies the people when they should be stirred up to revolution. Americans believed that they were a Christian nation that needed to stand up to the atheistic Soviet Union. It's during this time the phrase, "under God," will be added to the Pledge of Allegiance, as well as "in God we trust" will be added to all coins. While faith in God became an American thing during this time, unfortunately, America was empty of theological content. Yes, we had a faith in God, but another question was, who was God in America? Well, that depended upon the individual. Francis A. Schaeffer was an American pastor who ministered for many years in Switzerland. Attempting to become a more effective minister, he gave himself to studying the history of Western civilization. He eventually became a prophet of sorts, crying out against the twisted affections that had corrupted the civilization of the West. In his book, How Should We Then Live?, Schaeffer presents his understanding of the history of the West from the Roman Empire to the late 20th century. He argues that the greatness of the West was found in its embrace of Christianity. When the West was most consistently Christian, it was at its greatest. When, however, it was not true to its Christian beliefs, it declined. Toward the end of this book, Schaeffer observes that the West at the end of the 20th century was unraveling. It was discarding the Christian beliefs that held Western civilization together. Rejecting these beliefs, people had begun to idolize personal peace and affluence. Can anything be done for a civilization so given over to pursuing the inward effects of the fall? Schaeffer insists that to remedy the situation, the West must return to the worldview that made it great, the Christian worldview. But for this to happen, Schaeffer warns, Christians must be the first ones to renounce their idolization of personal peace and affluence. That description, I believe, is a really good description of the truth of it all. If we want America to be a great nation once again, we can't trust in politics. We can't trust in freedom. We can't trust in security. We can't even trust in ourselves. Rather, we need to trust in the Lord. And it begins with the Christians, not the unsaved, who need to turn and desire to seek after Him. Let's continue. Letter B. The fall of China to communism. Question is asked, who were the two leaders of China before World War II? If you remember, they were Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong. After the war ended, both men resumed the civil war that they had been fighting before the Japanese had interfered. Because Mao and the communists made empty promises to the peasants, they eventually gained enough popular support to take over the government. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists instead fled to the island of Taiwan and formed the Republic of China. Hopefully in your homework that you guys did, you guys saw page 352, the map of China and Taiwan. That definitely would have helped you on the map to be able to get that done. The U.S. has since supported this island nation since its creation, although mainland China still claims it as its own. Number one, let's talk about what China became under communism, under Mao. In 1949, mainland China became a communist country under Mao Zedong. Mao hoped to revive the struggling economy, so he developed a Soviet-style 5-year plan to increase agricultural and industrial production. He combined farming regions into collective units and controlled industrial development through a centralized economic plan. At best, the results were mixed. China and the USSR did not always get along. One thing that many people in the Cold War didn't realize was just because you're a communist country doesn't mean you get along with the other communist countries. This was a false view that many held on to. During the 1950s and 60s, animosity actually grew between the two nations. In 1969, the tension escalated into a border conflict with Russian and Chinese forces engaged in a limited war. So China and the USSR, although they were both communists, they didn't always get along. In 1958, Mao's new economic plan, called the Great Leap Forward, resulted in a decline in production and millions died from starvation. Mao planned to double the amount of agricultural products and steel. To do this, he ordered unskilled workers to produce the steel, which often proved to be impure and useless. Farming techniques proved to be ineffective, however. Mao, wanting to show the world that his program was working, continued to export what grain that was grown to other nations. Meanwhile, some 20 to 30 million people died from starvation. This great leap forward, I think, is better described as a stumbling, falling, tripping backwards. In 1966, a social and political purge called the Cultural Revolution occurred, where gangs of communists killed anyone who, quote-unquote, opposed communist rule. Mao's young followers formed Red Guard groups. These gangs threatened all elements of Chinese society through their violent attacks on anything considered a threat to the communist revolution. Number 2, China after Mao. Mao died in 1976. The leaders of China after Mao decided to take a different approach to the economy. Mao was a pure communist, wanting to follow communism straight to the end, and as we saw, led to drastic negative consequences. But afterwards, some economic reform took place and the economy began to improve. They eliminated some of Mao's repressive controls, allowed some foreign companies to build factories in China, and created millions of jobs for the Chinese people. However, economic reform does not mean political freedom. In 1989 at Tiananmen Square, a peaceful protest against the government was violently crushed. Political reform had not occurred. This is a famous photograph that was taken during this time of a man standing up to the tanks there. Shortly thereafter, the tanks would march into Tiananmen Square, and thousands, about 2,000 people, died in this protest. Communist leaders sent in tanks and violently ended the demonstrations. While China today is an economic powerhouse, they are definitely not a free nation. Communism still controls the country today. That's all the material that we're going to cover for today and this week. Remember, this is the last video of week 5. Please make sure that you get your test and your homeworks turned in, and please hold on to your chapter 19 notes. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.